So one of the things I deal with the most on this world building series is continuums, and nothing being really one extreme to the other, but lying somewhere between two extremes: hard magic, soft magic, that kind of thing, pantser, planner, that kind of stuff. And today we're going to look at what should be a continuum, Grimdark, the grimmest and darkest, to YA, more kid-like stuff, and actually look at how they're pretty much the same thing. Hi, I'm Matt, and once a week I break down world building techniques, tricks, and tips. And today we are going to look at genres, specifically YA, Grimdark, and how they're both kind of the same thing. Okay, so to start, we should recap about genres. One first thing to remember is that they are applied after the fact by audiences and booksellers. That means that we were trying to categorize things, where to put them in the store, back when we still bought things in stores. And so that's why a lot of times like science fiction and fantasy are kind of lumped together into one section, and romance was over there, and literary was over there. And I should point out that we are actually speaking about genre fiction as opposed to upmarket and literary, which are different types of things. Maybe there's a graphic up about them. Basically breaks down literary as stuff that you win an award for because you have great prose. Upmarket is stuff you discuss because it was on Oprah or Reese Witherspoon. And genre fiction is what a lot of us write in, and that is stuff like thriller, romance, horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And each of these genre fictions comes with their own genre expectation, which is to say what the audience expects from reading something within this genre. And a lot of times they're kind of eponymous. Thriller is, the genre expectation is how thrilling it is. Romance, how romantic. Horror, how much did it fill you full of dread and fear. And I maintain that in science fiction and fantasy, since they're both speculative fiction, their world building is actually what the genre expectations are, as in the audience expects to see something that doesn't exist in the real world. They expect to see something that breaks the laws of physics or breaks the laws that we know. Anyways, that should be a whole other story in and of itself. But within a genre, say science fiction or fantasy, specifically fantasy, there are subgenres, and they are specific traits of what you expect for that type of thing. And they're applied again after the fact, as in people kind of wrote stuff, and then we were like, oh, well, that's an epic fantasy. Oh, that's sword and sandal, or sword and sorcery, or urban fantasy, or that kind of thing. Where they were, I'm betting the original authors were just writing their own thing, and then people kind of started lumping them together. Side note, authors can then, like, I am going to write an urban fantasy, and then, they should know their subgenre and the expectations, therefore, about it. And I've also said before that these subgenres, at least I think I've said it before. Anyways, subgenres really come down to the type of world building in it. I know, because this is a world building, channel. So anyways, epic means epic in scope, usually means quests, that kind of thing. A large area, it's connoted. Urban fantasy, it's going to be an urban location, urban world building. Gunpowder, fantasy, or flintlock fantasy, as I've talked about before. The other part of world building that affects the subgenre is the analog cultures that you take from, wushu, which I probably just mispronounced terribly. The new one that I'm enjoying right now is pre-Columbian kind of stuff, but arthurial, as in Arthur legends, that kind of thing, all take a specific time period and an analog culture. And so use that for the world building, and what you're going to get in terms of world building by the subgenre you pick, and vice versa. And the world building and subgenres can affect a lot of things, even maps, as we've discussed before, because you're having an epic fantasy, you expect a very large map because quests and that kind of thing. And urban, we don't really need a map because it's all going to be in a city, but sure, maybe Portal, probably want a map. Again, world building. So the subgenres. But I also maintain that these are kind of nouns. They describe the thing of what it is. It is a urban fantasy. Definition of what it is. Flintlock fantasy, same thing. What you're going to get. High fantasy is kind of a catch-all, as in it's an offshoot of Tolkien kind of thing. You're going to have a lot of magic, a lot of species, races, that kind of thing. And, so it's kind of epic, but it's going to be big. Anyways, in addition to your noun subgenres, I believe that there are adjective subgenres, which brings us back to Grimdark and YA. and a whole bunch of others, but we'll get to them in a second. Grimdark, for those who don't know, is a spoof on a Warhammer game, and I think it started with "In the grim darkness of the future," something or another, and it became kind of a joke, and George R.R. Martin, is notorious for it. Abercrombie, whose name I always mispronounce, so I'm sorry if I did that. But anyways, it's kind of considered anti-Tolkien, but it's also notoriously hard to define. One time I heard an author talk about it on the Grimdark podcast, and he compared it to a burger, and said it's really hard to define. It's like, everyone's got a different definition of what a burger, like, it needs more pickles or some kind of thing. And I don't really personally agree with that. I'd apply abstraction, which is I don't know if we've actually done an episode on that, but abstraction is how you can look at a genre and you kind of start cutting things away from it. It works for tropes too. So if you take a vampire and you start cutting it, does it need to be allergic to garlic? Some people have that, but you cut that and you go, it's still a vampire. That eventually you get to can I cut the teeth or the drinking blood? And you're like, no, those are pretty defining traits of a vampire. So personally, when I apply abstraction to Grimdark, I eventually come down to it's an amoral protagonist in an amoral world. Some people say there's nihilism involved, but I don't think personally it needs that. But it is very anti-Tolkien in that just because you're good, you're not going to survive. You're not going to win. Let's look at Game of Thrones. It's complex heroes, amoral world, and the people have also pointed out that Tolkien has in a lot of the traditional kind of fantasy has here's a chosen one from a prophecy, and Grimdark does not have that. You are scrabbling to survive kind of thing. So that moves us to YA, which is young adult, which is originally an age category, meaning 12 to 18 or 21, depending on who you think, because originally this was set by booksellers and stuff. You had literature that was aimed at children and adults, and then sometimes people who are transitioning kind of thing. And so it usually involved protagonists of that age and a coming of age story. And some of the classics that have been around before this was even considered a category was Little House on the Prairie, Robert Heinlein's work, his Juvenalian work? No, not Juvenalian. Anyways, Robert Heinlein had some stuff, Wrinkle in Time, and I had read that Lagoon, with Wizard of Earthsea was the one who created the young adults subgenre, but all these other ones kind of predate that, so I don't know, maybe that was the first time it started doing it, but at any rate, all those examples except for Little House on the Prairie shows that there's a strong tie between young adult and science fiction and fantasy. But young adult is kind of used as a pejorative now, and it means that it's got a romance angle, and especially if it's a female protagonist, it's kind of got this Mary Sue thing going on. I think this comic that has been going around for a while sums it up best. And it is hard not to see the fingerprints of Hunger Games and Twilight all over Shadow and Bone that I'm watching the second season and not really enjoying it as much. What it means, you can see how the subgenre has kind of changed over time, just from an age category to it's about finding love and there's romance and da-da-da-da-da. And that just goes to show how subgenres and genres themselves are kind of defined after the fact and evolve over time. But if you wanted to write a young adult or a Grimdark, you couldn't just say, I'm going to write a young adult or YA. I'm going to write a Grimdark. You need a Grimdark X. You need a YA dystopian, YA fantasy, YA YA romance. I don't know. I'm trying to blank on them. You can't write you can have a Grimdark Flintlock fantasy, as I have, or you can have a Grimdark urban fantasy. You can have a Grimdark epic fantasy. Any of that. And that's why I argue that these are more of adjectives, because they attach to existing noun subgenres. Dystopian YA, Grimdark, urban fantasy. You could even have a young adult Grimdark epic fantasy, as Tamandro Whitecastle did a while back. And these adjective subgenres kind of add new dimension to existing noun subgenres in my taxonomy of it. Other adjective subgenres can also include dark, which means you're bringing horror elements into it. Cozy, which means low stakes, and is a big thing right now. Progression, I would also argue, is that Will White has shown us that you can have a progression, Waishu, I'm so bad at that, I should really learn how to pronounce that, John Bierce was on and he was telling me about he's seen a progression one that it's people in an office fighting off the monsters of their office and gaining powers from it. So anyways, yeah, you can set progression in different locations. Noir is more of a tonal thing, and Noble Bright, which is reaction to Grimdark, so you've really made it when you have a reaction, which is funny because Grimdark is a reaction to Tolkien and epic fantasy and high fantasy. But anyways, so again, you can also stack these adjectives on top of each other when you attach them to a noun. So if you wanted to make a dark, cozy progression, Noble Bright, urban fantasy, you probably could. And if you do, please let me know, because I really want to study that world building and see how you pulled it off. So there you go, adjective and noun subgenres. I hope they can help you to build some better worlds.